So I'll take this opportunity just to make some of the functional announcements. If anybody needs to use the conveniences, they are behind the stage, accessed from under the from the courtyard. In the event of an emergency, our gathering place is in the North Quad. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koe, rangatira kai whakawā, Helen Wynne-Coleman. Tēnā koe mātua, Ken McInerney. Tēnā koutou ngā tangata whenua, and tēnā koutou ngā manuhiri. Ko Rob Murfitt, taku ingoa. Ko ngā wharanui o te kura o te kai whakawā, John Fogarty. So I welcome you all, both people of this area and all of you who are visitors today. A special welcome to our Chief Justice, and I acknowledge kaumātua Ken McInerney. My name is Rob Murfitt, and here we are in the great halls of learning of our dear friend and our colleague, the Right Honourable Justice John Fogarty, King's Counsel. These halls and buildings are where John, along with many who are here, studied from 1967 until we graduated in 1971. Professor John Burrows, who is here today, was just a few years older than us. He was on the staff, and he could verify that John was a top student, a diligent studier, and keenly interested in the law. I was somewhat different, paying some attention to study, but too much to the pursuit of parties, girls, and alcohol. Some would say those were legal qualifications in themselves in those days. John was a little older than most of us and way more mature. He had the advantage of having had a year out in the world, even if that world was the seminary, when he dabbled with the idea of becoming a priest. Even at university, he was a mentor to many in the class, setting the stage for his future in life. One time I recall him saying to me earnestly that I should pay more attention to study as, quote, "You're quite a decent guy underneath it all, really." I wrote that in my diary in 1967, so it must have had an impact at the time. Throughout his career, John was a wise counsellor and mentor to many. Some here will know that in a special way. Karina Tay, Tony Couch, James Wilding, and many others would join the ranks of those who have benefited from his guidance, as well, of course, as his 3 children, of whom he was intensely proud. But it's time to move on. Today's gathering is to celebrate the life of John, to share the memories of the way he was. You will hear from his children, his good friend David Creera, who can speak of John's adventures in the mountains, Chief Justice Helen Wynne-Coleman, who will talk of John in his professional judicial life, his friend Lee Robinson on the profligate adventures that they shared, pursuing business and enjoying sport. We will hear a poetry reading from Tom Weston, King's Counsel, who worked with John at Western Ward and Lascelles, and an aria from Rosamond, Matthew, and Zelta, neighbours and good friends of the Fogarty family, respecting John's wish to have music featuring in his farewell ceremonies. And we will hear a special reading from his grandson Gus, and in closing, a karakia from kaumātua Ken McInerney. We plan to finish a little after 4 p.m. The family would be pleased if you would stay for a while for a cup of tea or coffee and some finger food to share your own thoughts of John. Bridget and Franny and Gus will now speak to us of their father.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for you all being here today to celebrate our amazing father. I'm going to share a bit of a timeline of Dad's life so everybody can understand where he came from and journeyed through his time here on earth. John was born into an Irish Catholic family. His great-great-grandfather Patrick was from Limerick. He came to New Zealand in 1965 to go gold mining on the west coast. John's father Frank was his great-grandson. He was the eldest in a family of 6. He married Shirley Raven and they had 3 children, Mary, the eldest, John, born on the 12th of August 1947, and Philippa, the youngest. For the first 2 years of his life, John lived in Greymouth. He used to tell the story of how he ran away from home when he was a toddler and was found near the railway line, although Mary said he was found on the steps of the pub. This was his first encounter with fate. His family moved to Timaru when he was 2 years old, where his father ran a department store called Beath's. This is how he inherited his sartorial style. The family lived next door to a golf course, and John said he played golf from the age of 4. John also played cricket and rugby. As a child, John used to sleepwalk. On one occasion, he was heading to Butler's Crossing at Pleasant Point. Fate intervened again and stopped him before he reached the river. When he left school in 1967, he spent 1 year studying to be a priest in the Catholic Diocesan Seminary in Christchurch. He said he enjoyed singing the Paansen Gregorian chant. Canterbury University followed from 1968 to 1974, where he graduated with an LLB with honours. He was a junior lecturer at the University of Canterbury for 1 year. John married Nan in 1971. From 1972 until 1973, he completed a master's degree at the University of Toronto. Following that, he came back to Christchurch to join the firm of Western Ward and Lassells, and he became a partner from 1975 to 1985. During this period, children Peter, Bridget, and Francesca, myself, were born. Fate intervened once more when John attempted to climb Mount Cook with John Stanton, and fate hung in the balance over them as they sat in a storm under a rock at the top of the Caroline Face for 3 nights. In 1985, John took up practice on his own as a barrister. In 1989, John helped organise the 15th World Games for the Deaf in Christchurch, mainly the party at Canterbury University, which was described as the loudest and longest they'd ever had. In 1989, the family moved to Casterton, where they lived until the earthquake in 2010. John was appointed a Queen's Counsel in 1990 and became a judge of the High Court in 2003. In 1995, John and Nan purchased Amaru Bay on Waiheke with Mary and Andrew, where we enjoyed many beautiful summers there as an extended family. On the 4th of September 2010, fate intervened again and crouched beside Nan and John as they sheltered under the doorway of their house at Casterton, with bricks, chimneys and walls falling down around them. John then moved to Auckland a few years later, living in Devonport and enjoying the weekender life on Waiheke. John retired as a High Court judge in 2017. Whilst I've provided you all with a timeline and highlighted some key milestones in Dad's life, these moments don't even begin to encapsulate who Dad was as a man, friend, family member, lawyer, husband and father. His friends and colleagues here today will add colour and life to Dad's journey on this earth, which I know you will love hearing about. Dad instilled so many important values to us children. He lived a life of service to the law, his family, community and friends. The guiding principles by which he lived his life continue to inspire us, and we are forever grateful to him. His immeasurable loss will be felt for the rest of our lives.
Thanks, Brenny. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much all for coming. It's great to see so many faces that we haven't seen for a long time, so thank you so much. I'll begin by reading my brother Peter Fogarty's eulogy for Dad. Peter is joining us via live stream from Mexico. As the wind fills his sails and the rainbow road rises to meet his feet, this mihi mihi is for one of the greatest humans I have ever known, John Gerard Fogarty, King's Counsel. Throughout my life, my father led humbly with an example of what he thought a human being should be. Others have spoken of my father as a mountaineer, lawyer, Queen's Counsel, fisher, tramper, loyal friend and family man. In many ways, John worked diligently behind the scenes to ensure the smooth functioning of our society according to its laws and social mores. Many young and elderly deaf have paid their respects to my father for his work for the National Deaf Sports Federation, now Deaf Sports New Zealand. Good man. And if that was not enough, good man with puffed cheeks. John made great sacrifices for his family. These sacrifices were cruelly underlined by the disease that robbed him of his well-deserved retirement. I love you, Dad. This is from Peter. Your presence in our lives will remain in the front of our memories to the end of our days. Now back to me, Bridget. As a family, we've been so humbled by all the testimonies that everyone has sent us since John's passing in December. So many of you have talked of his generosity of spirit, kindness, and support to you all. It's been really lovely to hear, so thank you for sending them. My cousin Tirokuro Solomon sent me this poem by Maya Angelou, and I'll leave it to Maya to surmise how we as a family feel. My son Gus and I, John's first grandson, I will read it together. When Great Trees Fall by Maya Angelou. When great trees fall, rocks on distant hillsides shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall into forests, small things recall into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear.
When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly, our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory suddenly sharpened examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality, bound to them, takes leave of us. Our souls, dependent upon their nurture, now shrink, wizened. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. We are not so much maddened as we are reducted to the unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves.
And when great souls die, after a period peace blooms, slowly and always irregularly. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses, restored, never to be the same, whisper to us, they existed. We can be and be better, for they existed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget, Fanny and Gus. And from a distance, Peter, we welcome you too. In his own time, John was a sportsman and an adventurer in various ways. As Franny mentioned, in his youth he lived opposite a golf course. It was the Highfield Golf Course in Timaru, where he was coached by his father in the immaculate golf swing which he maintained all his life. It was here too that he developed his friendship with to-be Justice Nick Davidson, also a keen golfer. It was here that he once beat the professional golfer John Lister, later a winner of 4 PGA tournaments, in a local match. He modestly mentioned that to Nan, but he never boasted of it more widely. Such a shame. John had a wonderfully slow, easy rhythm playing golf, and I still channel him when my own game is going askew. In the last few years, when John's health was deteriorating, he still gained a lot of pleasure playing golf with other friends, Ross Maguire and Sir Graham Pankhurst, both of whom are here. It's been a privilege to take John to his old course at Shirley and see the enjoyment he gained from that. I also want to acknowledge the role of his Waiheke friend, Paul Mayhew, who took John for games of golf on the island in those trying years. In the photo display that's to follow later, you'll hopefully see the relaxed swing of the man in action. But John had another outdoor pursuit in the mountains. He was a tramper and a mountaineer, taking risks and enduring dangers which would daunt most people. His old friend, David Crerar, retired coroner and retired mountaineer, is now going to tell us of John, the mountain man. David.
Kia ora. John was a mountaineer. He was a very good mountaineer. John loved the mountains, the bush, and the sea. I love the saying, the man at the top of the mountain didn't fall there. The philosophy of effort creating reward is shared over many pastimes, but it is in the bush and the mountains that John found great happiness. There is a purity about tramping and climbing. Mountaineering requires skill and experience and hard work. The rewards are outstanding, both physically and spiritually. I cannot claim to have introduced John to the attractions of the backcountry, and I know that he enjoyed expeditions such as a crossing of the Copeland Pass and an ascent of Mount Franklin before we came close. But I was present during the trip, early in John's courting days, that was mentioned at the funeral. This is the climb up Mount Rolleston from the Waimak Falls hut. Those of you who've been there will recognise there's about a 300-metre ascent up the gorge to the hut, and it was really hard work. I was young, fit and foolish, and wanted to contribute to John's blossoming romance with the young, beautiful and dark-haired art student with whom he was in love. As those of John's journal recalls that I, in a fit of enthusiasm, carried Nan's pack up that last 300 metres ascent on the top of my own. And he also records his surprise when he saw a copy of War and Peace, hard covered, unpacked. And Nan, why did you need 2 copies? John was a mountaineer of confidence and ability, with many successful trips to his credit. His diaries record 13 ascents of Mount Rolleston, including the more difficult routes via the Crow Glacier, the Beely Face, I was with him in a storm, Samson's Couloir, and the Otira Face several times. He also climbed Avalanche Peak, completed the Phipps Temple Traverse, and climbed other mountains in the national park. During a most successful expedition to the Heim Plateau, that's in the headwaters of the Rakaia and Rangitata rivers, he claimed ascents of Malcolm Peak and Mount Nicholson. Climbing experience was a prerequisite for sons-in-law. Hamish was only invited into the family after climbing Castle Hill Peak with John and I one Christmas Eve, and John told me on a don't tell Nan basis about his experiences in Switzerland with Ian. Apparently the Via Ferrata routes completed by John and Ian were several degrees greater in difficulty and involved much more exposure and risk than was expected by John, and I might say expected by Nan. What a great idea it was to invite family and friends to join them on a hike up Mount Richardson before the wedding of Bridget and Ian. As we aged, we accumulated greater family responsibilities, our expectations lowered, and more straightforward objectives were sought. Several families were hosted by Bruce and Helen McFarlane at Conway Flats, and a climb of Te Ao Wakari in the Seaward Kaikoura's was attempted. We had a high tent camp and an early start, but the team was blown off the final slopes in a blizzard. Families were again a priority during a visit to Nelson Lakes, but 4 of the fathers escaped responsibilities and climbed Mount Angelus over one night. Mention must also be made of the worst journey in New Zealand, the crossing of Whitcomb Pass by John and Nan, together with John and Barbara Stanton, Mike French and others. It was cold, very cold, and it was wet, very wet. The phrase, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, was coined. A more enjoyable trip involved John and Nan, Rob and Denise Murfitt, with Janice and I landing on the beach at Mason Bay on Stewart Island, staying in the dock hut for a couple of nights, stalking kiwis and then traversing the island to catch a water taxi back to Oban, showers and alcohol. John contributed to mountaineering in a positive way as well. He was secretary in the Canterbury Mountaineering Club for some years. He taught basic skills during climbing courses, and he helped carry a new door up the Rakaia Valley to Lyle Hut. Observation helicopters were then for sissies. Mount Cook was always an ambition for John. He really wanted to get to the top. John Stanton, Ian Valentine, with John and I spent a week in Plateau Hut waiting for the weather to clear. The time wasn't wasted. We had roped up belay practice to get to the toilets 50 metres away, and we ended up calling ourselves the Plateau Hut Bridge Club. It was about a year later that John was invited by John Stanton to instruct in a training course based at Multibrun Hut. The two Johns and Wayne Mullen then climbed Haast Ridge, spent the night in Plateau Hut, intending to climb Mount Cook the following day. The weather at midnight at Plateau Hut was poor. So they decided to walk out over Cinerama Col that morning. The wind dropped while they were walking over Cinerama Col, and a spur-of-the-moment decision was made to climb the East Ridge. They camped on the flattish spot about halfway up and continued the following morning in high wind, plummeting temperatures and deteriorating visibilities. With some misgivings, they decided to continue up to the summit ridge and seek shelter in the shrund known as the Middle Peak Hotel. John fell. Although he was not hurt, the incident resulted in an immediate decision to bivouac where they were. They were under a rock, but otherwise in the open, pinned to the mountain and suspended from their harnesses in a webbing of ropes secured to pitons. Clothing and sleeping bags were soaked and temperatures were freezing. They had nothing to eat or drink. John said in his diary that when the weather cleared, he could look down through his legs for a vertical mile down the Caroline face. They endured those conditions for 3 nights until they made it to the summit ridge where they were rescued. In his diary, John again confesses his role in the recovery. The helicopter appeared. The other 2 released him from the rope. He was the only one with children at the time. The rescuers beckoned him over to the helicopter and they wanted to hand him a radio. John misread the invitation, jumped onto the skid of the hovering helicopter. The Squirrel was operating its maximum altitude, so the pilot was forced to rebalance by flying in a steep dive down the Caroline face. The incident and the bivouac affected John deeply, and he ceased high mountaineering after those experiences. Sam Mann, who's the son of Peter Mann, was very close to Derek Morse, who was a former president of the Canterbury Mountaineering Club. Derek was a mountaineering mentor to both John and I. Sam writes about Derek in his book, The Water Thieves, and records him during a particularly memorable episode in their relationship as once saying, "You know, I wouldn't exchange this moment for any other in the world." I'm blessed to have shared such moments with John. We had a bottle of Piper Heidsieck in the dusk on the top of Mount Iron after I'd been telephoned and told of the birth of my youngest granddaughter when we were driving home from Treble Cone. I recall a discussion over a beer in the Frankton Arms Hotel, also after a day's skiing, and we argued the spiritual aspects contained in Bill Bryson's book, A Short History of Nearly Everything. There was a night poignantly recorded by John in his essay, published in the Canterbury Mountaineering Club magazine in 1974, On Being Born, which I commend to the family. And the sunset on the beach at Sandy Bay Hut in Lake Manapuri, with John explaining, and he had a glass in his hand, how much Ian would love Fiordland if only he could be persuaded to shift to New Zealand. We shared the hut with a group of Israelis who had earlier, and rather diffidently, asked us if they could celebrate their Sabbath with us that evening. John was so excited about that, I think he would have paid to have joined in. And a more recent memory was the hour or so we spent in the top of the Tasman Glacier waiting for the ski plane to come back during our trip in 2019. We reminisced there in situ about the wonderful times we'd shared. I'm grateful to John and to Nan and to the extended family for their being a most valued part of our lives.
John had told me there were 2 occasions when he was in such peril that he thought it was his final days. One, of course, was the occasion you've just heard of on the Caroline face. The other was the earthquake in September 2010, when he and Nan were rudely awoken to the cornices of their bedroom falling in on the bed that they were hastily leaping out from. In his last days, John and Nan talked about his wishes for his funeral ceremonies. He was able to tell her that he wanted music. Rosamond MacDonald, accompanied by her sister Iselta Ellison, violinist with the Christchurch Symphony Orchestra, and her brother Matthew Ellison, trombonist with the NZSO, will now perform the cantata Eternal Source of Light Divine by George Frederick Handel. Rosamond's late mother, Dinah Mayhew, her children and her husband Paul were good neighbours and friends of the Fogarty family for 30 years, in their years living at Casterton in Bridle Path Road. And Dinah, in fact, sang at Bridget's wedding. This performance today is dedicated to the memory of Dinah and the memory of John. John was appointed to the High Court in November 2003, sitting in Christchurch until he and Nan moved to Auckland after the 2011 and 2010 earthquakes. But it nearly didn't happen, you know. While John's appointment was pending and was a closely guarded secret, he and a few friends, including me, Mike French and David Crerar, went in John's Campion motorboat on a fishing expedition to Pelorus Sound. A boatload of farmers were with us, including John's cousin, Bruce McFarlane. On our very last fish for the day, Dave Crerar hauled up on his line a very dead, undersized cod. Bruce McFarlane, in a mischievous moment, had sent the fishing inspectors nearby over to our boat, unaware that we were in fact holding an illegal catch. The inspectors warned John that he could be prosecuted, convicted, and his boat confiscated, but in fact let us go with a warning. Chief Justice Dame Sian Elias heard about this on the grapevine and had great delight in teasing John about it at his swearing-in ceremony, commenting that he'd had, she believed, some education in the Fisheries Act recently. In his earlier years on the bench, John had to grapple with a radical change for him from a clientele of business people and competition law to dealing with the graphic and often seamy side of crime. He gained a reputation in those early days for extracting pleas of guilty during the trials of his first homicide cases, 2 of them in Dunedin, as those accused got it off their chests. Perhaps the training for the confessional life had its benefits after all for John. Later, in Auckland, John enjoyed the company and chambers of Justice Dame Helen Winkelman, now our Chief Justice. He amiably told me stories of her reprimanding him almost daily for not wearing his hearing aids, and he did try to comply. She will now speak to us of John as a judge. Helen.
E te iwi kua tai mai I runga I te karanga a John. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. E te whāna pāni, Nan koutou ko ngā tamariki mokopuno hoki. Ka nui te aroha kia koutou. Well, I greet all of you who answered John's karanga today, and to Nan, Franny, mental block, Bridget, was right, Bridget, Peter, and all the grandchildren, I know you grieve the loss of this wonderful man. My role today is to speak to the contribution that John made as a judge to the law and to society. But John was my friend as well as my colleague in judging. I loved him as a friend. I admired and respected him as a judge. Well, fortunately for me, it's not possible to speak about his qualities as a judge without also speaking of the qualities that meant he was so well loved by his friends. John was a humble man, notwithstanding the very many gifts that he had, gifts which would make most people prideful, I think. He was an egalitarian and deeply committed to the concept of justice. I don't know, it might have had something to do with that time he spent in the seminary and his reading of the Bible. He was committed to the view that doing justice was the fundamental role of the courts. All of these characteristics came together in his day-to-day judging. They were expressed in the incredible courtesy he showed to people who came into his courtroom. And through his deep commitment to working for a just outcome, it was really a brave counsel who came to court to rely upon purely technical arguments. John worked in both the High Court and in the criminal and civil divisions of the Court of Appeal, but it was really the High Court where he most liked to be. He liked the bustle of it. and he loved the people and the stories that they brought with them into that courtroom. John was an excellent High Court judge. He was sure-footed and fearless. He was a sure-footed and fearless finder of facts. Factual findings lie at the heart of doing justice in the courts. Most cases are decided by the facts. Judges need the patience to listen carefully to the evidence and the discipline to find facts without fear or favour, and John had all of that. He also had a breadth of legal knowledge that is seldom seen. He had a knowledge of the law that was both wide and deep. The law really is an enormous expanse. It takes a particular kind of mind to be able to see the overall map of it and where each bit sits within that map. But John had that kind of brain. He was, in fact, a very brainy man. His intellect stood out even amongst the super nerds who make up the judiciary. There's quite a few of them here today. I salute you, fellow nerds. When I sat with him on the Court of Appeal, I could see that while the rest of us were down scrabbling around amongst the undergrowth trying to work out where we were on that map, he had already zoomed out and achieved a Google Earth perspective on the issues. Although he was comfortable in most areas of the law, John's great strength was in public law. He had such a good understanding of New Zealand's unwritten constitution and just how the law operated in the borderlands between the three branches of government. After his appointment, his knowledge and judgment was put to good use by the judiciary, judicial leaders seeking out his advice when tricky issues arose where the boundaries lay between the judiciary and the executive in matters of judicial administration. But his most significant contribution to judicial administration was made through the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is not as prosaic or boring as it sounds. The rules that govern access to the courts and the procedures applied in hearings can have a profound impact on what happens in a case, or whether a case even makes it to court. And John understood that, and although he would not be called a details man, I don't think, he agreed to chair the Rules Committee when asked to do so by my predecessor, Chief Justice Dame Sian Elias, who's here today. I served on that committee with him, and I can confirm that as chair, he attended to all the detail he needed to, and to all the technicalities as the role required. But the real strength he brought to the committee was his relentless focus upon what those rules were about, which was bringing us back again and again to the point that the courts must be accessible and a place in which justice is done. John was a distinctive presence wherever he went. He was ineffably elegant in how he wore clothes or a hat. I've never seen anyone rock a hat like he did. And how he played golf, and how he wrote, and how he thought. He was such an interesting and kind man, and when he smiled at you with his beautiful smile, because he was a beautiful man, and he smiled often, it was impossible not to smile back at him. He was much loved by his High Court and District Court colleagues in the Christchurch Common Room, and when he made the move to Auckland after the earthquake, he quickly won the admiration and affection of all of his Auckland colleagues. John is mourned by us all. We miss him. But it's also important that I mark his service as a judge of the High Court of New Zealand. I speak on behalf of the current and retired judges today in acknowledging his unique contribution to the law, to the judiciary, and to society. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Justice. You bring back strong memories of this man, the elegant dresser, Irishly handsome, and with a wonderful, wonderful smile. John always envied Tom Weston. They worked together at Western Ward and Lascelles and afterwards on the litigation between Telecom and Clear Communication. They were both King's Counsel, but Tom had managed to marry a career in law with expressing his finer creative talents. He was a drummer in a rock band and is an accomplished poet. and he has successfully climbed Aoraki Mount Cook, I think twice? Once. Tom has dedicated a poem to John and will now present that to us. Tom.
John, Nan, Bridget, Franny, Peter, out there somewhere. 40 years ago, I started working as a solicitor in Christchurch law firm, which had a very large litigation practice. Many of the partners will be familiar to you, and those names such as Jerry Lassells, Stephen Erber, David Holderness, just to mention some. The junior litigation partner was John Gerard Fogarty. The initials JGF became a familiar currency for me. John, as we've heard, then went to the independent bar, and I stayed on as a solicitor in the firm. 10 years after I had started, I was a partner in Buddle Finlay and acting for Clear Communications, a firm seeking to enter the New Zealand telecommunications market. Ultimately, this led to litigation with Telecom, as it was then known, High Court, Court of Appeal, and the Privy Council. As the instructing solicitor, I ensured that John was retained for Clear Communications, and Telecom assembled their own team, a formidable team: Jim Farmer, KC, Terence Arnold, Forrie Miller, again names to conjure with. In June of 1994, our legal team travelled to London for the two-week Privy Council hearing, and we stopped off in Tokyo for a couple of days. And on an occasion, the detail of which I now otherwise forget, we visited a garden with ponds, and typically Japanese, with carp swimming in said ponds. It was a small moment of serenity in an otherwise pretty hectic time. This interlude led to a poem simply entitled Tokyo and dedicated to JGF. It was not a poem about John, it was a moment shared with him. There are a number of layers to this poem. It starts with rain, a mass of umbrellas unfurling on the streets. They seem like cogs in some giant machine. This is compared with the calm of the carp in their pond. And then the rain ends and the machine peters out. The carp, needless to say, remain in their pond. This poem is for John. Within minutes, the street has blossomed into umbrellas like wet petals on the pavement, spokes catching on spokes as one stream converges with another, the drizzle is promised. Beyond the street, carp swim in a khaki-coloured pond, succulent in the murk, leaving streamers of wake, as if alligators moved about these waters fishing for raindrops. The rain comes harder, percussive on the gaudy cogs spinning in the machine of the steaming road, sending the wheels racing like crazy, like the orange and black carp rising against rocks in the rain, cavernous mouths swallowing the air and the whole sky. Shoppers stop in doorways and shake their hair from their eyes, touts catching these refugees from accumulation with brochures, bubbled with rain, yellow with commerce. See, already the rain lifts and the machine falters, carp swimming under the black cone of the stone pines.
Thank you, Tom. We'll take a short break now from talking and spend a few minutes enjoying a photo montage that will play of aspects of John's life. Those are the memories to hang on to. One of those was John, I think, on the Tasman, wasn't it, David? Yeah. So it was just a wonderful thing to be able to accompany John on probably the last great ski adventure that he had, skiing the Tasman, just a very few years ago. Lee Robinson is a lawyer and a partner in Saunders Robinson. He's been a good friend of John and Nan over the years, luring John into various sporting adventures and briefing John on some of his most significant briefs, including the delicate negotiation of some of the Catholic Church abuse claims. Lee, in fact, bought John's Campion motorboat from him, but was blissfully unaware of its near confiscation a few years earlier until I told him about it last month. In fact, he also didn't know that on that infamous fishing trip, John had grounded the boat on a sandbank just out of Havelock, a notoriously shallow waterway. I recall being waist deep in water, pushing it off the ground. John was a wonderfully intellectual man, an intelligent man, but as I think Bridget may have said at the funeral, practicality wasn't his strongest suit, and John's boating mishaps were legendary. Lee will now tell us of some of his escapades with John.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, katoa. Previous acknowledged guests and friends, Nan, Bridget, Francesca, and of course Peter, I think on video Zoom from Mexico, and other family members. I've had the privilege of being a close friend and colleague of John's for the past 50 or so years. I first met him in 1973 when, as a student at the University of Canterbury, I was lucky enough to be allocated to John's jurisprudence tutorial, held in John's office beside room D over here in the old university buildings on Worcester Street. It was a small upper room with a dormer window, and about 9 or 10 of us squeezed around John's desk in what was known as stacker chairs every fortnight for a 50-minute tutorial. I recall then thinking about John's soft and encouraging approach. It was never "you have to," or "you should do this or that." It was, "we need to strive to achieve this, we need to do this," whatever that might be. It was never directional, it was consensual, and in a way a partnership, he and us. John then and remained always at our level, the level of his associates, be they his friends, clients, and in later years, his subjects when he was sitting on the bench. Soon after those student days, I was to be on the other side of John on a few encounters, and still later instructed him on a number of large and ongoing, mainly civil matters. We travelled to the Privy Council in 1987, arriving the day after the British election in mid-June. Standing on the steps of number 12 Downing Street, the Privy Council chambers, John and I watched as the British Prime Minister James Callaghan drove past to meet the Queen to be sworn in as the elected Prime Minister. It was the opening item on BBC TV News that night, and John and I featured in the opening news item, standing on those steps, watching the Prime Ministerial vehicle pass the Privy Council chambers. We'd been in the country about 12 hours. We had a successful hearing, but we also forged a close friendship. And outside work time over there, we had some lovely social encounters. I recall, in particular, at the end of that UK trip, such an occasion almost led to some unfortunate consequences. We squeezed in a few beers at the end of the hearing until John, with seemingly little time to spare, hailed a London cab to take him to Heathrow to fly to Canada, where I believe he was to join Nan and her brother. On arriving at Heathrow, with little time left to check in, or so he thought, the cab driver sought John's advice as to his flight details and the terminal from where he was leaving. John's response caused some alarm for the taxi driver, who immediately responded and said, "But sir, this is Heathrow, you're leaving from Gatwick." A fast trip across London by the same cab driver delivered John just in time to catch his flight to Canada. We had many other trips, mainly to Australia, for hearings and meetings in respect of a long, drawn-out civil matter that Rob has referred to. We would travel for a week or so at a time, but we were always able to fit in some lovely meals and timely social engagement. We'd become close friends. John loved his cricket trips to Australia, particularly Brisbane and Melbourne for the Boxing Day tests. 4, I think, in total, with either family or our cricket group. He was ever the connoisseur of the game, particularly the longer version, always able to take in and enjoy the technical side of 5 days of Test cricket, but also always ready for a meal afterwards and to engage with all and sundry on the trip in his most usual, affable, friendly and lovely manner. John often visited us in Robinson's Bay for our annual party on Boxing Day. On one such trip, he passed through Devotional Bay, slightly exceeding the reduced speed limit for that area. He was duly apprehended by a very friendly traffic officer who indicated that in the circumstances he would provide John with simply a warning. John, in his ever self-effacing and modest way, pointed out to the officer that he was a judge, and in order not to be seen to curry any favour, he thought the officer should issue him with a ticket. The rather chastened officer duly did so, but in the process had to politely remind His Honour that as well as watching his speed, he should also perhaps check his warrant of fitness that had in fact expired 3 months earlier. The skirmish with the law and the reference to a fisheries officer reminds me of an incident similar in Akaroa that occurred to a soon-to-be appointed High Court judge who shall remain nameless but is here today. So fishing is not a strength, I think, within the law of the judiciary. There were many other happy, enjoyable, professional and social times with John. Lunches in Christchurch and in Auckland, trips to Oamaru Bay and Onitangi and Waiheke. Lovely walks on the beach, glasses of wine, humour, recollections of history and family tales, all highly interesting, friendly and enjoyable encounters. If it is a quality that sticks to mind, it is one of affability, loyalty, concern for others and respect. He portrayed that in all his roles. We saw it all the time. Sadly, as we know, his retirement was cut short by a cruel and debilitating disease. His passing was a relief, but a tragedy. We will miss you, mate. We thank you for what you brought and taught us. You leave a very large legacy, any part of which would be an attribute that people would be proud to inherit and exhibit. God rest you, John. Thank you.
Lee's story of Gatwick and Heathrow reminds me of another that Nan has spoken of when taxi drivers had to speed to rescue John, and in that case Nan, from a misunderstanding between the railway stations in Paris, when I think it was supposed to be Gare Nord, wasn't it? You were to be leaving from and some distance away. John was extremely proud of his children, but he was exceptionally proud of his grandchildren. You all entertained him with your antics during the years of his illness, and he loved telling stories to us about you. Gus, he would have been so proud of you for the way you spoke at his funeral, reading an extract from his journal, which he wrote in 2009, I think, around about the time you were born. The family would like to end the formal speeches in this memorial in the words of John. So we will let John have the last word through Gus.
There is an enormous sense of the natural when one holds one's first grandchild. How can people refuse to believe in God when examining such creatures? At present, I am reading the history of cosmological theories in the realm of physics. Einstein was overwhelmed by the fact that the universe can be explained by sophisticated mathematics. It moves in accordance with laws of regularity. Why, if all is mere matter, what is chance and survival? Darwinism is a great insight, but does not and cannot explain the world, for most phenomena does not result from chance. Then there is mathematics, As Dylan Mayhew said to us around our dinner table at Casterton, without mankind, there would still be mathematics. Gus is the latest embodiment of the laws of the universe, reflecting a degree of sophistication far and beyond that achieved by the most rational minds we have ever produced. Odd, isn't it? We stumble about using brilliant minds, yet each of us is a masterpiece beyond our own comprehension.
Thus speaks the intellectual. In his years as a barrister, John assisted the iwi of Waitaha in its efforts to be recognised as a separate iwi. He earned the respect and gratitude of the tribe for this, and so it is so fitting that this ceremony concludes with a poraporoaki, or farewell blessing of John's spirit from tangata whenua. Ken McInerney is a kaumatua of Waitaha and has been a friend of both John and Nan since the days of that litigation. He will now deliver the poraporoaki. Matua.
Kia ora koutou. John was an elegant man, and I have a small piece of his attire here to anchor him to this brief address. John was an old and very dear personal friend of mine, and a special friend of my iwi, Waitaha. It is a great honour to bestow this Waitaha blessing on him here today. The Waitaha people believe that a deceased person's wairua spirit can be commanded to leave this place on earth and to fly via Cape Reina through the sacred portal of Te Kupenga o Te Atua, which you know is the Orion constellation, into the Milky Way to join the stars of one's ancestors and to wait for us. I'm going to say the words in English and then follow them in the reo. Farewell, dear friend. Go to the great shoal of fish in the heaven, the binding place of the spirits, to the Creator, to your ancestors, to those gone before you. But remember to wait for us, your loving family, your friends. Farewell for this part of your journey. Haere te rangatira, haere ki te taha o te ika matarahi. Ki te heringa o te wairua, ki te kaihanga, ki o tupuna, ki a rātou I mua I a koe. E nāri tātaru mō matu, to whānau au hoa, haere rā, mai anai ne na tohu, tonu. Let your journey be of light, like the moon and the sun in the sky. Farewell, farewell, farewell. Kia rite te haere, ki te haere o te marama, mi te rā I te rangi. Haere rā, haere rā, haere rā. And now I'm going to tap 3 times to command his wairua to leave us. Kia ora.
That brings to an end the ceremony for today. Please stay, mingle, enjoy a cup of tea or coffee, and we'll see you down there. Thank you.